Let's open in a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for this day. We pray that you'll bless our time together as we discuss some pretty heavy topics. Pray that you'll always remember, though, that help us to remember that we don't have the spirit of fear, but of power. And we pray that you'll bless our time together. In Jesus' name, amen. Sorry about that. I forgot to plug in my video. It doesn't work when it's not plugged in. There we go. The reality is, tough topic today. A lot of things going on, any of which could take a couple of hours, presentations at a conference. And Okay, we're having a little audio or video problem. So a lot of things happening in the world today, and it does. I got this graphic from this morning's London Times, and I thought it was appropriate because it does seem like the world is literally coming apart. So here's some of the places we are on YouTube, Facebook, Vimeo, Rumble, Remnant Truth Network. You can look for us there at these sites. There's some things I don't talk about just because it's a hassle with YouTube. So we're still working on getting our own app and that type of thing. We talk each week about the convergence of all these things that are prophesied, that are happening, and they seem to be happening very quickly. This is the grid that I use. I won't talk too much about it today. Acceleration, convergence, logistics, and understanding. And it is, hopefully we'll get a greater understanding the closer that we get. This comes the passage I refer to every week from Daniel chapter 12 about, in the end, the wise will understand and instruct many. That's in Daniel 11. And then, none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And I was trying to come up with I always try to think of a graphic, something that would sort of implant it in your mind. And I came across this picture this week, which I think is kind of interesting. Now, I don't know that it gets everything that I wanted, but it is essentially a three-dimensional picture of a musical score with all the different parts. And you think of it in layers, like the viola part, the violin part, violin 1, violin 2, horns, trombones, trumpets. If you could take all of that score and just show the layer of the notes in a three-dimensional, here's a little bit closer picture of it, in a three-dimensional way, you see how complex a symphony is. But what do you find? And I'm not talking about modern symphonies where they think you have to use all 12 notes before you can use another note, which is just nonsense. I was listening to an interview this morning with Michael Walsh. He's the author of a great book that I've recommended for years. I can't believe I heard an interview of him on the book this morning on the old Dennis Prager show from 2015. I can't believe the book's been out that long. But it's essentially called The Devil's Pleasure Palace, Critical Theory, and how it's just torn everything apart. And he makes some interesting, and Michael Walsh, you need to understand, was a music critic. That's sort of where he started. But then he kind of went through a faith crisis, and he was questioning God and heaven and hell and all these things, and he looked at Marx and critical theory, the critical theory that came out of Marx. And what he found is that critical theory, and we've talked a lot about that over the past year, doesn't build up anything. It just tears everything down. It's a destructive force. And he talked about how he looked at it, because he's a music critic, what it had done to the arts, particularly music, the application of this destructive thing. And in his interview with Dennis, he said, this is satanic. But the interesting thing about this music, and I was thinking about Beethoven, who was deaf, and he constructed these great symphonies How did he do that? How did he get that out of his head onto paper? And the complexity of a symphony, and it's all harmonized. It all works. It's all integrated. I think it's a picture of how all of these prophetic scriptures will fit together, and we'll eventually understand the complexity, and it will be all harmonized. I don't know that we do a great job, because we pick this and we pick this, and we might pick this word. Then we might take, for example, an English translation of a word in the Greek that doesn't really mean what it means in English. And then we'll build a whole theology and teaching around that. And it's a mistake, because we want it to fit our preconceived notion, not what God's laid out in his scriptures. And the word I'm thinking of is apostasia. You know, it's used in Greek to mean a departure, a rebellion, or a movement away from a previously held position. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean rebellion against this particular entity or anything, but it's a change in your position. But people say, oh, well, it can mean departing. Look, departing's in the lexicon, so it must mean departing from one place to another, and that's just not a good way to interpret. So eventually we're going to have a good understanding, but until then, you know, we're trying to harmonize all this thing. We're trying to get on board with God's wonderful symphony. And if you've seen that picture I've used a number of times, that shows how all the scriptures are interconnected. And just the incredible design that is in Scripture. Somebody sent me, and if you want it, you can send me an email. There's a thing called Treasury of Scripture Knowledge that sort of interconnects all the different scriptures. And it's a fascinating study just to go down and through and see how they all interrelate. And it's a lifetime thing that we'll never get to. Well, I don't have too many comments about this, but this is incredibly tragic. A monster, an evil monster, went into a school and shot it up again. And it's only 10 days after somebody shot up a supermarket in Buffalo. And I'm glad the guy's dead. I'll be honest with you. Okay? Saved us all a lot of trouble. But the troubling thing is, as I've watched the interviews with the police and the people involved, there's a lot of things here that just doesn't make sense. They didn't go in for over an hour. He was outside the school shooting for 12 minutes before he went into the school through a door that a teacher had propped open that should have been locked. And then he got in there, and there was one lady, she heard on the news that there was a shooting at her daughter's school. She was working 40 miles away. She drove to the school. The police had not gone in yet. And she was so upset, she started running into the school. She got tasered and handcuffed. Other parents that were trying to get into the school were handcuffed by the police. Why were they standing down? Why didn't they go in? And finally, I believe it was a Border Patrol group that went in after they'd been told for 45 minutes, don't go in, don't go in, don't go in. And they said, you know, there's still things going on in there, and kids are calling 911. And, you know, there was one tragically, the police told them to yell for help. And the one girl yelled for help and was shot because she was hiding someplace. There were young girls that smeared the blood of their dead friends on them and played dead for an hour before the police got in there. It's just, and you look at the pictures of all these kids, all from, I believe, the same classroom, 19 children, 2 teachers. I don't know if you heard the story about the one teacher who was killed. Her husband of 25 years, they were high school sweethearts, had 4 children. He had a heart attack and died the next day. just incredible tragedy. And I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that the answer is not a bunch of politicians running around trying to make political points on this before they've removed the bodies from the school. What happened to us? The reality is, I don't think you can say at any point now that America is not under God's judgment. You know, and we raise these children telling them that, well, you're just a lump of cells that have evolved. What do you think the reality and the outcome of teaching generations of children now that's what they are? We've really lost our humanity. But something is very, very wrong with what happened there and how the response was handled. And I trust that people will get to the truth. Now I'm going to just give you a few sort of church-related news things. And this is interesting. I saw this in Christianity Today this week, or last week. Gordon Conwell is a seminary outside of Boston on Cape Ann, beautiful area of Boston, a lot of history, hundreds of year-old homes there, which is in America, which is pretty amazing. But they're selling their main campus, or going to try to sell their main campus and move to Boston. And the reason is it says here, after a decade of enrollment decline, leaders began to see the seminary's biggest financial asset as a liability. They hope relocation could be the big change they need. But this is true of a number of other seminaries. I was on a seminary board for a lot of years. It's probably been 10 years since I went off that board. And we were talking about this 15, 20 years ago about declining demographics and the cost of residential seminary education. I know a little bit about Gordon Conwell. I had a nephew who went there and graduated from there, but this is it's a problem, and it's a blessing, because there's some seminaries that should close, as we call them. They're cemeteries, and they don't teach the right thing. I understand that Fuller has had a lot of financial problems. They were trying to sell their campus, but they couldn't. They're in Pasadena, and Fuller has just put a huge amount of bad theology out into the church. So there's one. If it goes away, I'm fine with that. But this is a problem in the church. Here's another one. I guess this is good news. Willow Creek had a scandal involving Bill Hybels, their pastor, who resigned under some allegations, which he denied, which later reports said were likely true. The way he interacted with some women, I guess is the kindest way to say that. The church now is maybe half the size that it was a few years ago. With COVID and everything, they're cutting budgets, they're laying off staff. And given what Willow Creek has done to the church, I don't find this as bad news. But it should be a warning to other churches to hold firm to the faith and not do things like Willow Creek did. And then there was this huge report that came out from an organization called Guidepost about abuse, sexual abuse, and other abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention, where it was known that certain people had engaged in sexual abuse, and they kept a secret list, but they never publicized it or told churches, and everything got perpetuated. And I do not know what the end result will be of this for Southern Baptists. This is a huge scandal. I believe it's up there with the what's been going on with the Roman Catholic Church, which was a worldwide scandal. So I don't know that the reputation of that convention or denomination will recover before the Lord returns. So you can go online. It's by an organization called Guidepost. You can download it. It's hundreds of pages of long. They do name names in there, some very prominent, at least one prominent name. I've not read it, but I've heard of one prominent name that I recognize of someone who they found the allegations against him to be credible. So I think you're going to see a number of Southern Baptist pastors, leaders resigning. It is a major scandal. So that's just a little bit of snippets of news from the church world. Well, let's get into some of the topics. Now, I talked about Michael Walsh's book. One of the places where, this critical theory and the sort of the intellectual framework that it puts out has had a result is in this transgender nonsense that we see everywhere. Now, there's some good news on that. People are pushing back. For example, J.K. Rowling, there on the bottom of the right page, she has been, and I'm no fan of hers. I think her books have introduced a lot of the people to the occult, but she has been very strong about, we need to protect women. Now we have the new Attorney General in the UK. She says Rowling's a heroine. Very brave, very courageous. I'm on her side. And so here's one: teachers should not pander to trans pupils. That's politically incorrect now. So I just find it good news that at least there's some people in authority that are standing up to this nonsense. And it's not nonsense. It's really a fundamental, full-on assault on traditional Christian values and God's order of creation. So I'm grateful that there are people that are doing that. And it's interesting, even a newspaper like the New York Times, and this is the New York Times today, debate over transgender athletes imperils Title IX. That's a bit of an earthquake, a tidal wave that's coming out from the New York Times saying, maybe we're not approaching this the right way. At least this is the take on the article. Now, they try to work around it, but they can't work around it because it's not defensible. So they're saying, look, Title IX was set up to have, women, they have opportunities in sports, and people are forced to not speak. It cites a number of young ladies who say, we can't speak about it, they'll take our scholarships away. But we've spent hours and hours and hours trying to become a good swimmer or a good athlete to get an opportunity for a scholarship to school, and now they let a male come in and win all the women's events. And this has happened. So Martina Navratilova, a great tennis player who is a lesbian, she's come out and said this is destroying women's sports. And she just gets savaged online. The mob comes after you. So that's good news that people are doing. Well, I talked about this last week, the coming food catastrophe, and this very strange picture that the Economist put on. And I could go back through a bunch of different Economist covers over the years. They do, at the end of each year, they do the world in the following year. And it's sort of a predictive thing, and it's kind of cryptic, but it's their predictions. And a lot of times it's the imagery that they use is very, they seem to gather all of this from what they would call conspiracy theories. But then there's one a couple years ago, they talked about like the world in 2020. And it had the four horsemen of the apocalypse. They'll show things like needles, like injection needles. And it's like the next year, then all this stuff comes true. So are they in on the deal? Are they controlling it? I don't know the answer to that. But here they're talking about a food catastrophe, and they use skulls instead of kernels on the wheat, shocks of wheat. And that might mean, I talked to a friend who's probably a deeper thinker than I am, and he said, well, that might mean that death is coming at the harvest, because the harvest may be bad this year. The Week has also picked up on this. A lot of it they're trying to blame on the war in Russia. I don't think that that's true or fair. Hang on a second here. I have to. There we go. I had lost my preview, so I didn't know what was coming up. Now I got to get back to my slides. So, there's 25 million tons of wheat in storage in Ukraine right now. There are food riots taking place around the world in different places. Sri Lanka, Peru, Iran. In Iran, they cut subsidies for bread and food, and the prices of a lot of the food staples went up 400%. The other thing that they did, though, was they will still subsidize a little bit, but you have to get a digital coupon, which means they can track everything that you're buying and that sort of thing. And that's happening in Iran, which is having terrible demographic problems. Young people are leaving the country in droves. It causes them to not have enough people for their armed forces. So they do a couple things in response to that. They develop drone and missile technology. I think this plays into Bible prophecy. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But they can't get the wheat out. You'll hear someone talk about that. And this lady, her name is Sarah Minker. She works for a food analysis agency. She spoke at the UN Security Council a week ago in New York, and one of the things she said was the world just has 10 weeks of wheat supplies left in storage. I'm going to play a few clips of her because I think it's important what she says, and it's a reality. So here is Sarah Minker with the first part. I think I have 4 clips. Part 1.
I want to start by explicitly saying that the Russia-Ukraine war did not start a food security crisis. It simply added fuel to a fire that was long burning. A crisis we detected tremors from long before the COVID-19 pandemic exposed the fragility of our supply chains. I share this because we believe it's important for you all to understand that even if the war were to end tomorrow, our food security problem isn't going away anytime soon without concerted action. Now, on to the statistics. Grow Intelligence estimates show that price increases in major food crops year to date has made an additional 400 million people food insecure. Now, there are a few food insecurity statistics shared, so I want to define that by saying there's looking at number of people at $3.59 a day. So broader, but the march towards starvation. To put this into perspective, that is equivalent to the number of people that China has taken out of poverty in the last 20 years. In 5 months, we have undone 20 years of progress. Furthermore, our economic shock models show that year-to-date changes in prices of agricultural products have already affected some economies by 3 to 5% of their GDPs. Countries disproportionately affected are in regions such as North Africa and the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, and West and Central Asia. And it can get much worse. Data shows the food security challenges we face will last several years. There are 5 major challenges occurring simultaneously that are each individually extraordinary. Lack of fertilizer, climate disruptions, record low inventories in cooking oils, record low inventories in grains, and logistical bottlenecks that have already started to unravel decades of global economic progress. Without substantial, immediate, and aggressive coordinated global actions, we stand the risk of an extraordinary amount of both human suffering and economic damage. This isn't cyclical. This is seismic. It's a once-in-a-generation occurrence that can dramatically reshape the geopolitical era.
So, key words that she said there. Didn't come from the Russia-Ukraine war. This was a problem that was existing. It deals with supply chains, logistics. But then what did she say at the end? This is seismic, and this is once in a generation. So here's another part of her talk where she talks about one of the 5 things that she mentioned that are important.
Global drought conditions for wheat are the worst in over 20 years around the world. Major bread baskets, such as the United States and Brazil, the world's 2 largest exporters of agricultural products, are also experiencing extreme droughts. For example, Brazil's cropland soil moisture is at a 20-year low. Major grain importers in the Middle East and Africa are also experiencing record droughts. Namely, we have both major importers and exporters experiencing exceptional drought conditions.
And here's the next part.
Grains. Official government agency estimates from around the world put wheat inventories at 33% of annual consumption. Verifiable data from public and private sources that we as a company organize and then build statistical models to connect the dots between in our platform show that global wheat inventories are in fact closer to 20%, a level not seen since the financial and commodity crisis of 2007 and 8. We currently only have 10 weeks of global consumption sitting in inventory around the world. Conditions today are worse than those experienced in 2007 and 8. It is important to note that the lowest grain inventory levels the world has ever seen are now occurring while access to fertilizers is highly constrained and drought in wheat-growing regions around the world is the most extreme it's been in over 20 years. Similar inventory concerns also apply to corn and other grains. Government estimates are not adding up.
In other words, they're not necessarily telling you the truth. Now, I do most of the grocery shopping at our house. One is I don't buy lima beans. I never end up with a lima bean in my bag. Don't like lima. Yeah, amen to that, right? And that was like one of the greatest things about becoming an adult is I never had to eat lima beans again. That's how I view it. My wife would make a meal of those things. Go figure. We joke when we go out that, other than at a steak and barbecue place, that someday she's actually going to order something I want a bite of. And maybe that dream will come true someday. But she mentioned fertilizer, and if there's not enough, this is a Canadian derailment. I think this happened in Alberta, Canada. A train of fertilizer derailed this week, and all that fertilizer is gone. Now, that's just one little thing, but it's the stacking of things on top of each other that caused this to happen. So again, she says we got 10 weeks supply left. Here's the last clip I have from her talk. And I think it's important. And look, she's at the UN, and you can sit there and you can say, well, she's at the UN, we're all a bunch of globalists. And hey, listen, you can make the case that it's all planned, it's not accidental, I get that. But it's the reality that we live in. That's the point. How it came about, we'll be talking about that for years, but it is a convergence of a bunch of different events. And it started with supply chains, and it's multiplying. So here's what she has to say.
5, logistics. Russia and Ukraine used to provide nearly a third of the world's wheat exports and are in the top 5 exporters of corn globally. Combined, they used to export 75% of global sunflower oil supplies. All Ukrainian ports remain closed, making it impossible to move any of Ukraine's harvested grain across its borders. Shifting to rail will move less than 10% of pre-war flow. It's not enough. Russian exports, which also include fertilizer, are limited because of Black Sea maritime hazards. Any one of the 5 things I outlined would be considered a major issue in commodity markets. The 5 combined are truly unprecedented. I come here today not to specifically offer or provide solutions, as there will be other venues to do so, but rather to x-ray and diagnose the problem for those of you in this room that have the power to change the course of our history. In a world that is increasingly isolationist, we need to come together. Food is personal, but our agricultural systems are global. There is no version of the world where every country has all the natural resources it needs to survive and thrive. One key takeaway from our data is how often we see repeated examples of cause and effect, highlighting surprising connections and interdependencies. For example, the United States, the most self-sufficient country globally, a consumption-weighted basket of food, a grocery basket, has doubled in price since April of 2020. Price increases were driven by unprecedented demand around the world, increase alongside climate-related supply-side shocks. We cannot solve food insecurity on a national scale anywhere.
You know, I wish I read some of her reports. She's incredibly intelligent. She's a great analyst, and which means she would never qualify to be hired by the governing administration in our country because she's too smart. And she has a handle on reality. But the one statistic there, that sort of a measuring basket of food has doubled in price since 2020. And it's weird. I mean, we live in America, we have a lot of abundance, but we have major drought in the West. I mean, I don't even have graphics to show you. Lake Mead, which is a major water source and source of hydroelectric power, is at 30% of its capacity, the lowest that it's been since it was filled back in the 30s. Lake Powell, which was filled 60 years ago, I believe, it is at 24% of capacity. Eventually, they will have to shut down electric generation because there's not enough water flowing through to make the turbines run. Well, where were you when the lights went out in Vegas? That's a problem. This is, as she said, it's unprecedented. It's converging. I guess we could make her the guest prophecy updater this week. So she kind of picked up all of the terms that I try to use each week. It is a major problem. You'll see in just a moment. So here's Iran. They're having food crises. And here's these little things that cause illness that were on hiatus during Charlie Vector 019er are back and behaving in unexpected ways. It's all messed up. Everything is messed up. Death rates are way up. And it's just not from Charlie Vector 019er. In China, they shut everything down. There were over 1,000 container ships sitting off Shanghai, not moving, for almost 2 months. That's going to have a ripple effect about 60 days down the road, and it should be hitting here in June or July. You won't be able to get things. And it's weird. I go to the store one day, and we need romaine lettuce, and there's no romaine lettuce at one of the food chains. And then I go to another food chain, and it looks like romaine lettuce that walked here from California without water. And it's like twice the price that it was the week before. I go to the store one day, I want iceberg lettuce for salad. Yeah, I do eat salads. I know it doesn't look like it, but I eat a lot of salads. And there's no lettuce. I go back a couple days later, and there are heads of ice. They look like basketballs, these heads of ice. And I've never seen iceberg lettuce that big and heavy and robust in my life. But we're in the midst of a coming famine or food shortage. And I'm buying the best lettuce I've ever seen. I don't know what they're feeding this thing. Maybe it was grown in where that fertilizer fell off the train in Canada. I don't know. But China's been shut down. That's caused a huge amount of problems in China. Their economy is tanking. Xi is getting a lot of resistance. They had the premier of China, like the number 2 guy, come out and said, we got a big problem. Look at some of these statistics on GDP and inflation. So you can kind of see the gray line there, the dotted lines. You have global GDP and global inflation. So some places, like Saudi Arabia, they flipped it upside down. Their inflation is way below what the global is, and their GDP is way above. It's growing. Their oil company, owned by mainly the kingdom and the princes and the people in charge, is now the most valuable company on the planet. Tell that to our guys in charge. Energy is important. Here's Israel. Their GDP is up, their inflation, both way below what's normal. Here is China. Their GDP is above, growth is above. This was taken back in May, so I think it's changed, or it will change. And their inflation is level. Japan, their GDP is dropping, in part because they're dying. They lost, I think it was 750,000 people last year in total population. And they're a very closed society. They're below replacement level. China's below replacement level. The worst country in the world is Iran. That's why sometimes I think that it's this demographic reality that's hitting everybody. Iran realizes, hey, if we're going to do something with regard to Israel, which they really want to do, we may not have much time to act because people are leaving, our population is dropping, we're not replacing people, we don't have the young men that we need to be soldiers. And I mean young men for frontline fighting where, physicality is really important. Inevitably, I will get an email that says, well, you're making a generalization. Yeah, I'm making a generalization. The world runs on generalizations. As a rule, most men are stronger than women. It's a fact of life. And here's the United States, inflation above the global average, and GDP is below. And part of that is we don't have the workers. I don't know if I go any place now around Central Ohio where I do not see a help wanted sign on the business that I go into. Every single one. Which is, it's a lot of things like, this just doesn't make sense if the economy's tanking and all these problems. People are still going to eat and people are still going to live and that type of thing. Now the electrical grid. Here's a report from the National North American Electric Reliability Corporation on their assessment. And they look at the different grids that we have around the country. They're all interconnected. Texas is kind of off on its own. And it just says here, Mid-Continent faces a capacity shortfall in its north and central areas, resulting in high risk of energy emergencies during peak summer conditions. In the West, energy output from hydro generators throughout most of the western United States is being affected by widespread drought and below normal snowpack. Dry hydrological conditions threaten the availability of hydroelectricity for transfers throughout the western interconnection. What's the translation on that? You might have rolling blackouts. Oh, by the way, other parts of the country that power only really works when it's always on. And that's part of the problem with wind power, because wind power is not always on. Solar power is not always on. Solar power really doesn't generate anything at night, for example, at night. And most places have a night every day. It's sort of a fact of life. It's the reality of it all. So we have this, but Texas, because of the green people, they shifted a lot to solar and wind. They've decommissioned their coal-burning power plants. Germany decommissioned all of their nuclear plants, went to solar and wind. And what happened in Texas a winter ago? They didn't have the capacity. And the rest of the grid didn't have enough to transfer to them because they were at capacity too. And then it all started to unravel. And people died. And guess what? It looks like this summer this could happen again in Texas. It gets a little hot in Texas in the summer. Extreme drought across much of Texas can produce weather conditions that are favorable to prolonged wide area heat events and extreme peak electricity demand. Resource additions to the ERCOT system in recent years, predominantly solar and some wind, have raised anticipated reserve margins above reference margins and eased concerns of capacity shortfalls for normal peak demand. However, extreme heat increases peak demand and can be accompanied by weather patterns that lead to increased forced outages or reduced energy output from resources of all types. A combination of extreme peak demand, low wind, and high outage rates from thermal generators could require system operators to use emergency procedures up to and including temporary manual load shedding. That's a nice way of saying we're turning off your lights and air conditioner, or the whole system collapses. So this is, so these areas, this is the orange areas are areas that are likely to have problems. The red areas are very high risk. Fortunately, Ohio is not in that area, except the far northwest corner. But this is a drought and seasonal temperature outlook. It's snowpacks are way down. Talking to somebody in Colorado, they said their snowpack is way down this year. They had snow, but when they should still have snow at this time of year, it's pretty much gone. So if you want to drive through some of those nice, beautiful high mountain passes in Colorado, this might be the year, if you can afford the gas or the diesel. I know people are canceling vacations because of the price of diesel. Campground operators are hurting because people are canceling. Flights are being canceled because they don't have the crews, because of the stupid rules that they've put in. It's just, so at some point, you sort of come to the conclusion that somebody's doing this on purpose. They're either incredibly incompetent or they're really doing it on purpose. And who is it that's doing this? Well, this week they had Davos. Zelensky was there pleading for more weapons and that type of thing. He was, and a lot of the sessions were about Ukraine, bad Russia, good Ukraine. I don't want to get into that. And remember, these Davos people, these are the ones, and the funny thing is, with the internet, things are forever, because you can usually find through archive.org, you can find what people said. And this lady had written an article for the World Economic Forum back in 2016. Welcome to 2030. I own nothing. I have no privacy, and life has never been better. And so people like me and others who said, well, that doesn't sound good. That sounds like end time stuff. So then they took it down, and she came and said, well, that's not real. I was just sort of thinking about it and that type of thing. And the World Economic Forum said, we've never made this part of our predictions. Oh, really? Well, look at what happened in 2016. This was published on the World Economic Forum website, and you can find it at archive.org, published November 12, 2016. 8 predictions for the world in 2030. And it said, as Brexit and Donald Trump victory show, predicting even the immediate future is no easy feat. When it comes to what our world will look like in the medium term, how we will organize our cities, where we will get our power from, what we will eat, and what it will mean to be a refugee, it gets even trickier. But imagining the societies of tomorrow can give us a fresh perspective on the challenges and opportunities of today. And so here's what they say. This is their prediction. All products will become services. Oh, and then they quote from Danish Member of Parliament, Ida Auken. I don't own anything. I don't own a car. I don't own a house. I don't own any appliances or any clothes. But I'm happy. So now, I mean, and they even made up a video. If you look at this video, at the beginning of the video, they quote from this. This is from the World Economic Forum. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. That's their own publication. So all these fact checkers, Reuters, and all this stuff, they're right around saying, it's not true, this is false. World Economic Forum never said this. So I'm fact checking the fact checkers. You're fake. You're false. How about that? That's a fact check for you. So they had this meeting in Davos, hadn't met for a couple of years. Interesting one, Jack Posobiec, conservative blogger, was detained. I think he's the only person that got detained in Davos. They brought in 5,000 military and police to handle the 2,500 people that came in. In other words, to keep everybody away from the 2,500 elites so they didn't accidentally mix with the common person. But it's sort of, this is, look at the logo on the police, World Economic Forum police, and they'll say, we didn't have police. Oh, well, you had everybody walking around in body armor and weaponized and everything that said World Economic Forum police. Did they just all make it up? Every single one of them? But look at it, it's like two rams butting heads, which kind of raises the imagery of Daniel chapter 8. Now, Daniel 8 is a ram and a goat. But it's just kind of interesting that they use this kind of biblical imagery in describing themselves. Here is one of the things: history is at a turning point. History at a turning point. Of course, Klaus Schwab, the non-sectarian head of World Economic Forum, wink, wink, wink. This is a photograph of him. This is not photoshopped or made up or anything. He's just hanging with some of his buds. Here's just a brief clip of what he said at the beginning of the conference.
Let's also be clear. The future is not just happening. The future is built by us, by a powerful community as you here in this room. We have the means to improve the states of the world. But two conditions are necessary. The first one is that we act all as stakeholders of larger communities, that we serve not our only self-interests, but we serve the community. That's what we call stakeholder responsibility. And second, that we collaborate. And this is the reason why you find many opportunities here during the meeting to engage into very action and impact-oriented initiatives to make progress related to specific issues on the global agenda.
Now, if you were sort of going to central casting and said, hey, I need this guy that, the conservatives in the world and the religious people will think is, kind of not a very good person. And let's see, we want a kind of a tall guy, maybe German accent, bald. You got him. You couldn't do it any better. This is from the London Times this morning. This is where I got this morning's graphic for the title slide. And so, everything was against Putin. And so now in the Ukraine war, everybody's saying, well, Putin is the only thing standing between us and the New World Order. I don't believe that. That's just my opinion. You're free to disagree with that. But look, ignore the doom-mongers of Davos. Putin hasn't torpedoed globalization. In other words, what he's saying is, relax. The move towards the New World Order and globalization is on its way. Just a little bump in the road, China, Russia, all these other people, but pretty soon they're all going to be falling into line, like the United States. How long did that take? This was another article I saw on Bloomberg. Forget Burning Man, psychedelic shamans now heading to Davos. They had, like magic mushroom eating shamans, mystics at Davos. I never get invited. I'm not saying that that's bad, but Davos has always sought to raise global consciousness. Sounds like they're doing unconsciousness. That's my editorial comment. Addressing topics like food scarcity and climate change, but psychedelic drugs? These substances are still illegal in most places. Finding out that influential shamans and companies will present in Davos in parallel with a gathering of the World Economic Forum inspired me to take a look at what the industry has to gain from a platform with the global elite. Here's what they have to gain. You'll own nothing, and you'll be happy. And you'll be stoned out of your mind, but you'll be happy. And I'm just telling you, this is the sorceries of pharmakia that I think we've talked about in Revelation in a couple of places. But this year's gathering of government leaders and corporate executives will have access to a medical psychedelics House of Davos program with almost 40 sessions and speakers, including researchers, entrepreneurs, investors, and some who consider themselves shamans. While not part of the core Davos agenda, the program has a space on the town's main promenade, which traditionally showcases Fortune 500 companies. Mark Hazen, Chief Executive Officer of Energia Holdings in New York, a New York-based company that's hosting the event, said this, quote, "It's really a big shift for world leaders to inquire about how they might be able to use psychedelics. Like they've done such a good job with everything else that they've gotten to use." This is, I will admit, I could use the word frightening, so I'll soften it a little bit and say it's extremely gravely concerning. How's that? That's softer landing on that one. Here's Stephen Bancel, the head of Moderna, which is one of the companies involved in getting out the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019, talking about distributing the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019 in a panel. And here's what he had to say. How's it going with the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019, Stephen?
I mean, I guess I'd just say
I guess I don't have the clip. What happened to that? Hang on a second here. Well, I don't know what happened to that. Okay, sorry about that. Here we go. Here's what he had to say about the state-approved, what they're doing with their stock of state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019.
And we don't think this is the priority right now. As Seth knows, we are now throwing those into the garbage. It's sad to say. I'm in the process of throwing 30 million doses into the garbage because nobody wants them. We have a big demand problem. We right now have governments. We try to contact, not only Seth, who is doing great work with his team trying to get demand into the countries, but also we contacted through the embassies in Washington, every country, and nobody wants to take them. And so the challenge we have now is it's a very different situation than we had 2 years ago. The problem we had 2 years ago is there was no mRNA capacity in the world, zero. The situation is very different today. Moderna has 3 billion doses of annual capacity. Pfizer has 4 billion doses, that's 7 billion doses, and the Chinese don't want the vaccines of mRNA. So if you just take the Chinese population out, you have more than a dose per person. And as we just discussed, the issue in many countries is people don't want vaccines. In the US, people don't want vaccines. Around the world, we have a lot of people who don't want the vaccine. That's a problem Seth and his team are working against. So we don't have a capacity issue around the planet. It is not true. It was true 2 years ago. It's not true today.
So what he said was a little hard to understand him a little bit. We've had to throw away 30 million doses of this thing. So, depending on your view on this, that might be good news, might be very bad news. But he said it, calling all the embassies in Washington and stuff, nobody wants them, can't even give them away. New York Times Magazine this morning has a whole big, I believe it's the cover story. You only have a view about not taking the state-approved treatment if you've been radicalized. So here comes with the misinformation, disinformation thing. And you see this push all the time. So here's another panel. This is the e-safety minister commissioner from Australia, by the way, which elected a left-wing, what appears to be a left-wing government, and a new prime minister who is extremely anti-Israel. Understand, the Bible says in the last days that all nations will gather together against Israel. And so you're seeing the pieces being put in place for all of that. So here's Australia, which seemed to be pro-Israel. Now they've got like a guy who, would give Jeremy Corbyn in the UK a run for his money on being anti-Israel. So here's their e-safety commissioner. They put in an online safety law last year, and we've talked about misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, that our government keeps pushing this narrative about, if you can't have hate speech, you can't do this. We need to get rid of the First Amendment. The First Amendment never protects hate speech. Well, yes, it does. You don't know the First Amendment. When you say that, you prove that you're ignorant about the thing. So here is, her name is Inman Grant, and here's what she had to say about that.
I mean, I guess I'd just say we are finding ourselves in a place where we have increasing polarization everywhere, and everything feels binary when it doesn't need to be. So I think we're going to have to think about a recalibration of a whole range of human rights that are playing out online, from freedom of speech to the freedom to be free from online violence.
By the way, do you know anybody who's been the subject of online violence? Not online attack, online violence. But this is in charge. And of course, this week, our baby Trudeau up north had to weigh in on a similar subject. He didn't go to Davos, but he was still on topic. Here he is.
There's a new report today out from the University of Ottawa regarding national security. Four former national security advisors to the Prime Minister, quote, concluding that the traditional approach to national security no longer sustainable and that Canada is not ready to face this new world of security threats. Now, do you agree with these sentiments and what ought to be done?
There is no question that the world is changing rapidly and getting more dangerous in new ways than ever before. When we look at the prevalence of misinformation, of disinformation, the way social media has been weaponized both by foreign actors and by people within Canada pushing extremist views, trying to foment anger and discord, whether it's extremist ideology and right-wing terrorism on the rise in Canada, or whether it's examples like the illegal protests we saw in the winter. There are a whole new set of challenges that we need to be responding to, and that's why we're working closely with our national security agencies, working closely with organizations like the Canadian Security Establishment around communications to make sure that we are able to respond to these new realities. We need to do it, however, in a way that continues to defend freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to protest, to legally protest, while at the same time we're taking on more tools to keep Canadians safe. Because increasingly we're seeing that things that start online end up having impacts on the real world.
He's a very special person. It almost is like, though, I mean, it's almost like either he was possessed by Nina Jankowicz or she was possessed by him, or they're all getting the script from someplace. So if you're in the mail, and you're delivering these World Economic Forum scripts to people, if you could just slow that down for a few months till we kind of get the food system and everything back on track, that would be very helpful. I'm not telling you to break the law or anything, okay? But just maybe consider slow walking some things. So this is a U.S. Supreme Court, Homeland Security issued a thing this week about there are going to be protests and violence about the decision on Roe that's coming out. I'm surprised they haven't released it yet. DHS is committed. And they always say this, right? Like, I don't really believe you. You're making up an information ministry, the ministry of truth. You hire this lunatic, Broadway show singing TikTok Twitter person to head it up. And by the way, the guy that was detained in Davos, she was online doing interviews this week and posting, he was the guy who got me fired or made me resign, Jack Posobiec. And I'm sure there's no connection between any of this, but so this is what our DHS said, is committed to protecting Americans' freedom of speech and other civil rights and civil liberties, including the right to peacefully protest. DHS is committed to working with our partners to share timely information and intelligence, prevent all forms of violence. But they really won't come right out and say, who's the people who say they want to burn down the Supreme Court? They won't talk about this. So here's another thing that they were talking about at Davos was, hey, here's a great app. And this is one of the executives from Alibaba, the Chinese company, talking about a great app.
We're developing, through technology, an ability for consumers to measure their own carbon footprint. What does that mean? That's where are they traveling? How are they traveling? What are they eating? What are they consuming on the platform? So individual carbon footprint tracker. Stay tuned. We don't have it operational yet, but this is something that we're working on.
Social credit system. So look, I have my own carbon footprint tracker. Like, it's on my credit card that I use to pay for gas at the gas pump. I know how much it's costing me. So here's an interesting little, this is a mashup of a couple clips from one of the world's leading billionaires who thinks he's better than everybody else. It's an interesting interview with somebody who said, I've had lunch with all these people that go to Davos and stuff, and they're just people. They're stupid like we are. And I think there's some truth to that. But here's our friend Bill, and also the head of Pfizer, who seemed to be in a little bit of conflict about the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er. Bill seems to have had a reality check a little bit. But look, this is Bill Gates. This is a direct quote for the fact checkers. This is what he's talking about. He's one of the biggest supporters of these things in the world. And so here's what he had to say, followed by the guy from Pfizer.
With vaccines, we want vaccines that are infection blocking and long duration, which today, the vaccines have saved millions of lives, but they don't have much in the way of duration, and they're not good at infection blocking.
The goal is to prevent the sickness, and that will maximize your chances to do well, and that will maximize the chances of people that you love not to get infected. Yeah. You vaccinate not only for yourself, you vaccinate also to protect society, and particularly to protect those that you love the most, because they are the ones that you are together.
So they're not reading. Apparently, somebody's script got delayed in the mail or the email. Somebody's assistant deleted it. There's a good article at an organization I've just become aware of recently called the Brownstone Institute. You can look it up online. And they're good conservative thinkers about some of these big issues that we're facing. And one of the things that they talk about is the panopticon. Now, I have a master's degree in criminology, correctional administration, so I studied about this in graduate school. And this was a prison design that came out by an English philosopher and social theorist named Jeremy Bentham back in the 18th century. And the design, and if you've been inside a prison or prisons, by the way, I have, but not because somebody told me I had to go there. I went there because I was working there. But Statesville Prison in Joliet was a good example of a panopticon. They had a big rotunda, and they had a tower there, and from the tower in the center, they could pan and look at every cell. But the advantage of the panopticon was that the prisoners didn't know who they were looking at. So they were always under surveillance, and the theory was that this would cause them to change their behavior. And it does work, if you can even see little kids, is mom looking? They know. And so this was the way they designed prisons. And so it's like, and somebody took the graphic and they said, well, here's a modern version of the panopticon. People imprisoned and being watched all the time, but they don't know that who's watching them. And I thought this is a really great graphic. Somebody did a great job of making up a graphic to recognize the panopticon. And so we've been talking about the World Health Organization. They want to do a pandemic treaty, and there were changes to international health regulations, IHRs they call them. It seems that some of that stuff is not moving forward like they thought. The U.S. withdrew 12 of its 13 amendments to the international health regulations because of a lot of people protested to call their congressmen and that type of thing. And it became politically costly to support that. So the Biden administration withdrew their things, but this is an article from May 25th. I guess that's earlier this week. World Health Organization deploys another disease threat to push global surveillance, and that's the monkeypox. And you'll see a great meme I saw is that the K in monkeypox is silence. Moneypox. Okay, yeah, you got it. And so this is what they were doing, and it came out on the day that they did this event over a year ago. And so, hey, yeah, let's talk about a weaponized monkeypox thing that comes out on May 15th, 2022. And I could show you news reports from May 16th saying, hey, we have an outbreak of monkeypox or moneypox. And it's a longer incubation period, it's a longer infectious period, which means if they do start doing lockdowns, they're going to be even longer and worse than they were with the prior Charlie Vector 019er. Now, this is Reuters, though. This is WHO calls emergency meeting as the cases top 100 in Europe. Quote, there appears to be a low risk to the general public at this time. So members of the WHO are currently working on a new pandemic prevention and preparedness treaty. They hope to have that out by 2024. This is some graphics, infographic that they released. Why do we need an international treaty? You can stop that and read about that. This is the guy who was reelected head of the World Health Organization for another number of years. The guy was part of a leftist Marxist terrorist party in Ethiopia, but he's okay. So here's what this Reuters article, I think it was Reuters article. Well, I can't remember where I got this. Yeah, you can look it up. Members of the World Health Organization are days away from voting on an international pandemic treaty and amendments to the international health regulations, which would give the unelected WHO greater control of national emergency healthcare decisions. And I kind of made up a little thing I put up on Facebook, I want to know who's controlling the new pandemic. Who is controlling the new? Let's talk about it. Who is controlling the new pandemic? That's right. No, who? Yes, exactly. No, you don't understand what I'm talking about. I'm asking, a pandemic happens and who is in charge? Exactly as you said. You know, and it's just, it's like an Abbott and Costello routine, and it's like, but it's a nightmare now. And they want, what do they want? New powers to push? Passports, global surveillance, and global coordinated actions that address misinformation whenever it is declared a health emergency. So you got passports, global surveillance, global coordinated actions to address misinformation. So they've got the quad there. They've got all four of the major things that they want. And somebody says, considering that the WHO has a history of spreading false information, the call to address the problem seems at best disingenuous. And the Brownstone Institute says, all things considered, however, disingenuous messaging should be the least of our concerns here. If the current draft becomes a reality, the light from the panopticon will shine even brighter. This is a brilliant article, especially with the, and that, by the way, that's, in the background there is what Statesville Prison in Joliet, Illinois, actually deposed a guy who spent 18 years there. That was an interesting day. I'll have to talk about that sometime. He lifted weights for 18 years. He committed murder, and I had to depose him in a little tiny room. Did not look forward to that. And I shook his hand. It was like grabbing a 10,000 volt electric wire. Anyway, there will be nowhere to hide. Vaccine passports will be the norm, and our right to privacy, or at least some degree of privacy, will become but a distant memory. So while everybody's excited about the fact that they withdrew these amendments, it's not something to be that excited about, because it's really something to still be concerned about, because they're still moving forward with this. In fact, this is a European Commission has talked about the EU digital Charlie Vector certificate and how everything, when they get it, will be interlinked. Even Macron has come out and said, I've got the English translation here. The WHO is the only legitimate institution to guarantee universal health security and allow us to have a coordinated, united response. Calls for strengthening the WHO to build a better, safer world for future generations. And so that's what they're talking about. I could say a lot about the war in Ukraine. I can see the minutes are fleeting by. Look, Russia is on the left is what the initial war looked like back in March. Then April, things were smaller. Now they're even smaller still. They're in this Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. Look, I think that Russia has taken over these areas in dark red. Russia has a superior military. I think they're going to be okay here, but it's not going, I think any objective observer has to say, listen, it's not going as well for them as they would have liked. The Ukrainians have done a lot of counterattacks. Russia keeps refocusing. They have sort of had this region. Now they're focusing on this small region that a lot of people are saying it's not really that strategically significant. And again, there's Ukrainian counterattacks. But listen, Russia's got a lot of military there. They are trying to cut people off. There's a rail line there. And I think the lady at the UN was, Sarah Minker, was correct that getting goods shipped by rail out of Ukraine is problematic at this point. There was also, and so now there's, there's Russian offensives in other areas. There's this river that goes down through in the remember that big pontoon boats that got blew up, and it appears that about 400 Russian soldiers were killed at that particular location. But a lot, I would guess that the casualties on both sides in terms of those that are dead or wounded, while dead, are in easily in the thousands on both sides. I mean, this has been a brutal war. Russia's gained, they've got Mariupol, they're making some incursions, they essentially control the coastline. This is a picture of, I think, a picture of Mariupol, and they're just bombing and shelling these cities into obliteration. And what do the people do that live there? I thought this was a very truthful, honest editorial cartoon in the Times of London the other day. I've taken another prize city. And the guy's looking around like, what city? Because they're just turning them into rubble. And this, look, here come the nasty emails. This is what has happened in Syria since Russia got involved. They've destroyed the cities to get people what? To pick up and move somewhere else. And guess what's happened? People have picked up and moved somewhere else. So it's destabilizing Jordan. It's having a big impact on Lebanon. It's having a huge impact on Turkey. And you'll see in a moment if I have time to get to it. And Russia's had problems, okay? Let's be honest. They're taking their training units. They have battalion tactical groups they had 125 committed out of 168 that the entire Russian military has. The battalion is about 800. By most estimates, they've lost 36 battalion tactical groups in the war thus far. They have massive injuries. They've even gone so far as to lift the top age for military service. It used to be, 30, now it's 40. It says here, until now, only Russians aged 18 to 40 were allowed. Now you can go above 40, and foreigners aged 18 to 30 were allowed to enlist. But listen, it's very bad situation for the Ukrainian military, especially in this region. The military is essentially surrounded and they're losing hundreds to thousands of people. And they're surrendering, deserting, whatever, because they don't have the equipment. And this was the Russian plan all along, was to break off these areas and surround the troops. Here's from Bloomberg. They're making progress in the east. That's sparking fears that they could be poised for a bigger breakthrough and leading to increasingly panic calls from Kyiv for more powerful weapons. And Raytheon's making hundreds of millions of dollars supplying weapons here. As I've said, the $40 billion aid package is more that was just approved by our uniparty in Washington is more than we will have agreed to supply to Israel in 10 years. Russia is winning the battle to control the world's wheat. That may be by design. Here's this why Ukraine's ports are so, this is from The Independent in the UK. And it just says that Vladimir Putin's targeting of port cities appears highly strategic. It gives Russia important leverage over the international community in terms of wheat. This is from Al Akbar in Lebanon. I only point this out is that this is a Hezbollah newspaper, but Lebanon gets way above 50% of its wheat from Ukraine, Russia. And it's not looking good right now. There's also a fuel crisis. Some of that is self-inflicted. What did Biden do the first day he came into office? He shut down the Keystone Pipeline. They're shutting down leases for oil drilling. All because they think that, well, just drive an electric car, Well, where does the electricity come from? Well, solar. In Ohio? Have you lived here in the winter? And so the grid's stretched because they're taking away power plants. They're recommissioning coal-burning power plants in places like China, India, because they having a heat wave and they need more power. So they're burning more coal than ever. Even India doesn't get it. You'll own nothing, you'll have no power, and you'll be happy. Here's your magic mushroom. Chew on that for a while. So now it appears that a lot of Ukraine got planted this year for crops. But now the farmers, and most of the fuel that's used is used for planting crops. But now they're like, in a few months when we go to harvest it, we don't know that we'll have any fuel to be able to harvest it, and it'll just rot in the field. That's a reality. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Middle East for a little bit, and I'll try to put things in context. Now, about a week ago, you don't need to put the sound up on this because it's somebody talking over Hebrew. Danny Gantz, this was May 17th at Reichman University at the Institute for Policy and Strategy. I think this used to be called the Netanya Conference, Netanya Security Conference. If you remember, a few years ago, I played you, and they bring all the military leaders in, and I played you the head of the Israeli Air Force, who came in and said, listen, we've got a problem on our northern border. And we had this war in 2006, and by the way, the end of that war, the anniversary of the end of that war, was celebrated this week. But he said, listen, in the next war, we are going to do in 36 to 48 to 72 hours what it took us. We are going to do way more in that period of time than we did in 6 weeks in 2006. It will be shock and awe, the translation way, it will be shock and awe like you've never seen. So Danny Gantz went and he said, look, we've got another problem. In addition to all these things, it appears that Iran has been hiding things from the international IAEA, the international agency that looks over nuclear production. And it's true. I mean, there were reports this week that, and there was one, I'll show you the clip out of the Wall Street Journal reported, an exclusive that, Iran had access to the IAEA reports and they were making stuff up. They were lying. Isn't that a big shock? Iran was the leadership of Iran was lying to the world. And so Gantz says, listen, we have a problem. They may be a few weeks away from having enough plutonium for a nuclear weapon. Now they've got to miniaturize it and put it on a missile and that type of thing, but still it's a huge problem. And it just shows that this was going to happen with Obama's JCPOA regardless. This is what was going to happen. So he said in this talk, Iran continues to accumulate irreversible knowledge and experience in the development, research, production, and operation of advanced centrifuges, stands a few weeks away. During these very days, Iran is making an effort to complete the production. And so he says, listen, we're going to have to do something. Now, immediately everybody said there's going to be a massive attack by Israel on Iran. That's not my view. That may happen. I don't know. I'm not in the IDF or the Israeli Air Force. You may not have noticed that, but they don't call me for advice. But again, one of the things I look at is logistics. Just like the lady at the UN, she looks at logistics. And when we look at these things that are playing into Bible prophecy, there's a logistical aspect about those that people have to consider. So what Israel did was they started a month-long exercise called Chariots of Fire, and it's a exercise that is designed to show what are we going to do, how are we going to defend Israel, and some of it is simulating an attack on Iran. Now, about a month ago in Israel Hayom, there was an article, an interview with Amon Sar, research brigadier general in the Israeli Defense Force. And he said at that time that Iran is, had this in my slide deck every week for the last month, but we have terrorist attacks coming. We have problems in Samaria. We have problems in Galilee. We have terror attacks happening internally. We have the problems with Gaza. We have Hezbollah in Lebanon. And we have Iran. We have this huge, complex situation. And what are we going to do? We know Iran's not there yet, but you can't wait until they're actually there. So, and they have, there are these settlements up there in the Galilee that, people are concerned about. They're within range of Hezbollah. You have the problem of the Temple Mount. Saar said in that interview in late April, Saar is troubled by Hamas' success in acquiring ownership of the Temple Mount. This is an event that is difficult to deal with because it belongs to the world of consciousness. It does not mean that it cannot be dealt with for a long time. This year, we have already succeeded more than in the Guardian of the Walls operation a year ago. But people understand this, that the great sayings of the Temple Mount shield have no cover. In other words, what he's saying is we have physical limitations on what we can do. And so when you look at things that are going on the Temple Mount, you see these pictures of the trash and things thrown and destruction of archaeological evidence. Lebanon is melting down. I mean, this was a article from, I don't know, a week or so. Lebanon has halted passport renewals in the country. Why? Because people were leaving. I think Iran is probably going to do the same thing. It's a brain drain. And so you're seeing the same thing happening in Russia and Ukraine, millions of people on the move. Saar defines Hezbollah as a terrorist organization that has taken over the country. But the problem is, how do they deal with the situation? So it was clear from Gantz's speech on May 17th in Israel that Israel was going to do something. And Gantz followed that up. He came to the United States and asked for assistance, like, can you help replenish our Iron Dome batteries? Because Jerusalem Day is actually today when they celebrate the reunification of Jerusalem from the 1967 war. We were there once for it in 2017, 5 years ago. And if you love Israel, it's a fantastic time to be there. I mean, they're marching around with flags. They're all excited. There's thousands and thousands of people around. But the Palestinians, or what they call the Palestinians, and Hamas, they don't like it. They're really upset. They consider it a provocation for Israel to actually fly an Israeli flag in Jerusalem. How dare they? Or worse, Jews go up and walk around on the Temple Mount. But it was clear from Gantz's speech that Israel was going to do something. Now, the question was, is it going to be a full frontal attack? And here's what happened. So I think it was 2 weeks ago, there was some attacks on sites in Syria. And on the way out, the S-300 missile defense system or air defense system was activated and missiles were shot at the Israeli planes, although I think it was more to send a message. A week ago, Friday, there were more attacks. One of those involved a container ship in the Tartus Point. So Russia really wants the big air base in Latakia and the Tartus naval base. But at the Tartus naval base, Israel went in and took out a bunch of containers that had been brought in from Iran by a container ship, and nobody fired on them then. So I think Russia's, to be honest with you, I think they're distracted. They've withdrawn. So what Israel did in downtown Tehran earlier this week, they went in and they assassinated a guy. And it's the Iranian papers said terrorists assassinate IRGC member. And here's the guy, and some of their websites describe him as a colonel. He was likely a brigadier general. He was probably in charge of a group called 840, which is designed to go out and assassinate Israelis. Sort of like, I think it's an open secret that the Mossad does this to Iran. And so you've seen a step up in some of these attacks. This is the Wall Street Journal. Slain leader led assassination plots. And this was a significant person. He was very close to Soleimani, who was killed in January of 2020 in a strike. Here's a picture of his funeral. They had these massive funerals. Unbelievable. I mean, I forget who I was. They actually, you can look on Wikipedia. They have like the most attended funerals in history. And there was somebody over there in the Middle East, and it was like, it was Ayatollah Khomeini. It was like 60 million people attended his funeral. It was like the biggest attendance at a funeral in history. And so during this, and this is a picture of the general's car, where he was shot. A couple guys on motorcycles came up, shot him 5 times, in the middle of Tehran, just a few blocks from the Iranian parliament, and in a highly secure area of Tehran. I mean, these people have some guts that do these things. Now, Israel never takes credit for it. And at the thing, though, everybody's saying, death to Israel, death to Israel. They carry his coffin around, pictures. I mean, it's a big deal. But here was also buried in this New York Times article a day or two later. A spokeswoman for the Israeli prime minister declined to comment on the killing. But according to an intelligence official briefed on the communications, Israel has informed American officials that it was behind the killing. Israel is livid that this happened. They told the Americans, they thought in confidence, you can't do anything in confidence with the Biden administration. So who leaked this to the Times? I don't know. Susan Rice, Valerie Jarrett, you pick your... They've got a pipeline. And they did this. It was a breach of confidence. So now everybody's upset. And this guy was a big deal. In fact, here is the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in the upper right attending his funeral. And he wouldn't do this for a member of the IRGC. He would do this for one of the leadership of the IRGC. And now they're saying we're going to revenge him. And it's kind of hard. They're kind of in a dilemma because they don't want to admit that Israel was able to go into downtown Tehran and do this. But if they don't call for revenge, then everybody in their country gets upset with them. So they have to, they're really in a difficult spot. It's really kind of a cool way that the geopolitics of this plays out. So here is the, and this is an analysis by Anna, and I won't try her last name, in the Jerusalem Post. She's a great analyst. I follow her. I mean, there's things she says I don't agree with, but she's pretty good. Seth Fransman, Jonathan Spire, the people that write for the Post, Jerusalem Post, are good. And she says this is Israel shifted its focus. And so what you're going to see, I think, is you're going to see more of these type of attacks. I don't think you're going to see a full-on assault. You're going to see more like, remember when Farid Zaked, the head of the Iranian nuclear program, was taken out by a remote-operated AI machine gun. And so you saw another thing in Parchin, which is a suburb of Tehran. There was an attack. And when there's an attack and things, it just seems like things blow up in Iran all the time. They have the worst luck. And it's a plastics factory. It's a gas explosion. It's a fire in a baby formula factory. There's always some ridiculous excuse that they make up. And we all know what it is. And there was a person killed in the attack on that Iranian military center in Parchin. And there's a sort of, somebody was doing a video of the, it was not with like a little boom. This was a kaboom that went off. But listen, sometimes the New York Times is helpful. And they came out and they said, listen, this was not an accident. This was an attack by a suicide drone or drones. Now, they don't come out and say who they were. Parchin is a sensitive military site where Western security services believe Tehran carried out tests related to nuclear bomb detonations. Drone strike on Iranian military facility is deemed an attack. And so they're going to do it. So I think I need to start winding this down a little bit. You would not believe how much stuff I have. There's a lot going on, but let me tie it up. It'll take 5 or 10 minutes probably. So this is an article from the Israeli. If you can get a copy of the Jerusalem Post from Thursday, Friday, it had a lot of great articles about defense and security issues. But here's an article from the other day. IDF wants the next war to be fast and lethal, according to a top Israeli officer. And part of this is because of this game changer, the drones and missiles. And Iran has been developing this. And this is also being developed by China for its attack on Taiwan. This is Milley at West Point.
And right now, at this very moment, a fundamental change is happening in the very character of war. We are facing right now two global powers, China and Russia, each with significant military capabilities, and both who fully intend to change the current rules-based order. Yet again, in Ukraine, we are learning the lesson that aggression left unanswered only emboldens the aggressor. The world you are being commissioned into has the potential for significant international conflict between great powers, and that potential is increasing, not decreasing. We are also on the cusp of a change in the fundamental character of war. The nature of war is not going to change. It's immutable. It's still a political act. It's a decision by humans to impose their political will on their opponent by the use of violence, as you all studied here. War will still be characterized by chance and fog and friction, and its causes will likely still adhere to Thucydides' famous analysis of fear, pride, and interest. But the character of war, how wars are fought, where wars are fought, with what weapons, technologies, organizations, and doctrines, in short, the ways and means of war, that is undergoing a fundamental, profound, and significant change.
And he's right. And so part of this is this drone and missile technology. And this is a Chinese ship that was released to the press this week. It's remote controlled, artificial intelligence, and it's designed to do drones and missiles. Now, there was also, sidebar, there was Jeffrey Nyquist, who I don't know, but I have a mutual friend who's close to him, so I kind of get filled in. And I was told a week or two ago that Nyquist had gotten his hands on a transcript of a meeting of audio. People have transcribed it and translated it now from the Mandarin. And essentially it was Chinese high-ranking officials and Communist Party officials talking about the fact that what they were doing logistically to prepare to attack Taiwan later this year. Now, the implication, though, is they're not just going to go after Taiwan. They're going to be attacking other people, like, countries that are very close to where we live, or maybe live in. And that's just the reality. You go to Jeffrey Nyquist's blog, and you can read about it there, and you can also do a Google search, and you can find the translation of this meeting. Listen, this fall is this is the reality of the world that we live in. I'm not trying to deliver you bad news. So we have got supply chain issues and everything else. The only thing that we don't have right now is an active war close. That may change this fall. I don't know. I'm not a prophet. I'm not predicting it. I'm just telling you what the Chinese are talking about. And they have things like this. So even in Israel, they're concerned about all the weapons that Hezbollah and Iran have in terms of drones and missiles. Is how do we defend against them? Because we have Iron Dome, but Iron Dome only gets us so much. We have of course, here's a report from a couple years ago that a multi-arena missile attack disrupts Israel's defense and resilience pillars. Here's a video from it's a cruise missile that Iran has developed that's an anti-ship missile, but it can be adapted to other things. And it has a range of about 1,000 miles. And so that would get it, if they launched it from Lebanon, it would go all the way to Crete, let alone all the way through Israel. There was also, this was in the Iranian press this morning, about a secret underground, several hundred meters under, or 100 meters underground drone air base in Iran. And so Israel has Iron Dome, but they don't have enough to go over to withstand this kind of an assault. They're developing laser technology, but that has very limited range. And it'll be great when it works, but it's not quite there yet. So that's why when I heard Gantz do his speech, I didn't think they were going to do this massive attack on Iran, because it's a logistical problem. They have F-35s and F-16s, but to get from Israel to Tehran is about 1,000 miles. So you have to get overflight rights. So do you think Syria or Iraq is going to grant them overflight privileges to attack Iran? Probably not. So there's some thinking that there along the Persian Gulf in Saudi Arabia, there's a military base in Saudi Arabia that Israel can use, or there might be one up there, up on the Caspian Sea in Azerbaijan that Israel's used in the past, but we don't know that for a fact. We also know that in addition to the drone manufacturing facilities in Iran, they're significant. They do a good job. They've just outsourced a lot of the drone production, at least for one of the drones, to Tajikistan, which is 1,000 miles further. So, for example, an F-35 leaving Israel, its range, it might be able to fly to Iran, but it doesn't get back. It needs to be refueled. Israel has, I think, 3 refueling tankers, like our tankers. They're aging. They're supposed to get new tankers from us, but not till 2025. So I think you'll see these other kind of attacks, at least for the foreseeable future, unless something really happens. Now, Israel does have submarines that they can use and launch missiles from the submarines, but there's a logistical problem. So the F-35 has an operational range. Well, I don't know, go watch the Maverick movie. It might tell you how far it is. It's probably about 500-mile radius that it can really operate in without being refueled. And the F-16s are not good long range because their engines wear out. So F-35, you could keep it up for 12, 13, 14 hours is my understanding. So we have a logistical problem. So just know that this is a big deal. And now you're seeing a lot of things about the Temple Mount. Today is the Parade of Flags. Everybody's on edge. Now, you can go get a live webcam. I was watching a live webcam at the Damascus Gate just before I came up here. And, there are people running around waving flags. It didn't appear that there was a riot going on, but these things can change pretty quickly. There was also this video that was put up on social media this morning. So terror groups are all upset about the Flag Day March. The Fatah leader in Jenin, which is a terrorist hotbed, said we're heading toward major escalations and killings. Shouldn't do the flag march. And here, this is horrifying. This is sensitive. You probably shouldn't watch this. This was put up on Arab social media this morning and then retweeted by Anna, the security analyst that writes for the Jerusalem Post. Jews storming the Temple Mount. This is pretty hard to watch. So this was this morning in Jerusalem. I know this is hard to watch, that they're storming the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And you see how the police have to hold them back? Not really, right? I'm being incredibly cynical and sarcastic. But they were upset. The king of Jordan was upset, Abdullah II. There were 2,600 Jews that went on the Temple Mount today. And he's been pushing to get Israel to be completely removed from the Temple Mount. And by the way, I'll talk about this at some point. I believe this is the Temple Mount, not over in the city of David. And there's a lot of reasons for that, good reasons for that. I think people think that, well, if we put it in the city of David, it'll be easier to build it. It's an Arab village of Silwan. It's not going to be today. It's not going to be any easier to build it there than the regular Temple Mount. And there's a lot of reasons for it. I don't know a credible archaeologist, biblical archaeologist, conservative, Bible-believing archaeologist that believes that it was in the city of David. They believe this is the Temple Mount. Go talk to Pam and I spent a day with Randall and Beverly Price when we were down in Lynchburg last fall. And I asked him about this, and he said, you know that's just a bunch of nonsense. So this is, listen, this is a hotbed of dispute right now. This is from a Lebanese, Al Jazeera, talking about this is a leader of the Qassam brigades in Gaza, claiming that last year what happened between Israel and the Arabs in Gaza was a victory. So when Israel withdrew, remember Israel voluntarily withdrew from Gaza back in 2005 under pressure from the Bush administration. Ariel Sharon capitulated to that pressure, withdrew. What did they do? They claimed massive victory. Look, we drove them out. They're retreating. We drove the Jews out. And this is the way they do this. So Israel went ahead with the Flag Day celebration today in Jerusalem because if they don't do it, the Palestinian groups will run around saying, look, they're so afraid of us, they didn't do the thing. And if they do the thing, if they do the flag parade like they're doing, they'll say, they're provoking us. Look at their storming the Temple Mount. And it's all just a bunch of silly propaganda. Let me see here. Well, we know, this is an interesting article. Iranian threats don't spook Israel, but the Temple Mount warnings do. In talking to some security military people in Israel, one of their concerns is, we're concerned about Iran, but they don't have the missile to launch a nuke over here yet. But they're close because they've got all of these organizations up in Syria. In fact, you can see this is what, so the Iranian pro-militias are blue. This is what it looked like in 2013, 2 years after the Syrian civil war started. This is what it looked like in 2020. After Russia got involved in 2015 or 2016, the Iranians became very entrenched in Syria. And don't think that Iran's going away from Syria anytime soon. Russia's withdrawn from a lot of their military bases. And the word is Iran's not supposed to take them over, but the other word I'm hearing is that they have. And so you're going to see attacks by Israel on these military bases, especially now that it appears that Russia's withdrawn from a lot of them. Israel's going to do what Israel thinks they have to do. So one other thing that I want to talk about, and I'll finish with this, Abraham Accords. Now, we have a son of a president right now who had a laptop. Remember, there's been a lot of, that was Russian disinformation. And 51 national security people said, that's not, doesn't look like anything we've ever seen. Yeah, because you've probably never seen a real laptop used by a regular person who's using it for business and making money. So Nina Jankowicz said, that's Russia. That's a Trump made it up. Trump campaign made it all up. So they don't want to investigate the corruption of a sitting president. Now what you're seeing you're seeing a series of articles in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Wall Street Journal about, look at that Jared Kushner. Now, I'm no fan of Kushner, but here it says, before giving billions to Jared Kushner's Saudi investment fund had big doubts. And what's happened is Kushner's been going around the Middle East, and he has been able to gather about $3 billion, $2 billion of which came from the Saudi Arabian sovereign wealth fund have given him money to invest in Israeli startups. And that's kind of significant. I mean, Saudi Arabia is not part of the Abraham Accords, but they're giving money to an investment fund that is using that money to fund Israeli startups in Israel. A Saudi investment fund, the sovereign wealth fund, is giving money to Jared Kushner to invest it in Israel. And so this is all part of this Abraham Accords that are happening. And so New York Times, Washington Post have been, oh, can you believe the corruption? I mean, they were in the government, now they're getting money from Saudi Arabia to do this, and it's just such a high level of corruption. And it's like, look around. I mean, Kushner's out of office. If you're looking for corruption, like, try New York City government or Washington, D.C. I think you might find some corruption there. I think I've told you before, I had an expert witness in a big case in D.C., and I went down and talked to him, and I'm talking to him, and he headed up the legal department at this agency, and his wife did this agency, and her ex-husband did this agency, and his ex-wife. And it's like they're interbred and intermarried more than European royalty, No wonder why they do such less than intelligent things, let's put it that way. So they're just watch this, because this is a big deal related to the Abraham Accords. And we'll talk more about the Abraham Accords as things go forward. And now they're talking about, look, there are the Biden administration has said, well, maybe we need to get on board with the Saudis. Why? Because they want to get away from the petrodollar. That's a big deal even for the Biden administration. So now they're pushing to broker a deal with regard to these two islands that sit at the entrance to the Red Sea, Sharm el-Sheikh down in southern Egypt on the Sinai. They really were to be transferred to Saudi Arabia, but that deal hasn't been done. So you got Amos Hochstein and these State Department people running around because they want a big victory. We're protecting the Saudis. We're such great people. And so watch this. So watch the Abraham Accords and the implementation, because I think it's very important. But the one aspect of this, like overflight rights, that I think we need to consider is this. This week, the Iraqi parliament approved a bill introduced by al-Sadr, a Muslim imam, cleric, banning all ties with Israel. So if you do anything, and it was unanimous vote of the Iraqi parliament, Iraq parliament unanimously passed a bill criminalizing normalization of ties and any relations with Israel, including business ties. Violation of law can result in execution or life in prison. And so there was these big celebrations in Baghdad and elsewhere in Iraq about we're banning everything that has to do with the Jews. And here you see Baghdad, and so you see the nations coming against Israel. Even our State Department came out and said this is not, what Iraq did was not good. It's completely contrary to the Abraham Accords, although there are Kurdish regions that really want to come into the Abraham Accords in Iraq. So look, it's all very volatile. It's a crazy world. And so just pray that what happened last year doesn't happen this year. This is a year ago on the day before Jerusalem Day. Remember, a tree caught fire from fireworks the Palestinians fired on the Temple Mount. And immediately social media was filled, look, they're burning down Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's propaganda. So just Israel has a right to celebrate the fact that they're a country. And we have a right to celebrate that it seems to be fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And it's going to be the epicenter of a lot of these things that unfold. And I'll just say this. There's a passage in Ezekiel chapter 39 talking about drones and missiles. In verse 3 or 4 of that chapter, it talks about, I'll knock the bow out of one hand and the arrow out of the other. And the question is that referring to drones or missiles and their launchers? The bow being the launcher, the arrow being the missile or the drone. More and more I'm thinking that because of the change in warfare. Even our Joint Chief of Staff, Milley at West Point graduation this week said, listen, war is changing. The world is changing, and we live in a world where it is the reality of things is it seems like the world is coming apart. That's the reality. And so we have to live in the reality that we live in. Not a fantasy world or anything. God's in control. But put your faith in Jesus because time is short. A friend of mine sent me an article, sent me a thought this week on Facebook. And he said, I don't know how long I'll be here. He's got a child with COVID right now. But I think it really captured a lot of his heart. He said, I don't know when my next conversation with my unsaved family and friends will be the last conversation that I have. And so the answer to that is make it count. Do the right thing. Share the gospel with them. Let's pray. Lord, just pray that you always help us to keep in mind the reality of the situation in which we live, that we're not supposed to have a spirit of fear, but we're supposed to act wisely. And also to use those opportunities to explain to people some of the things that are going on in the world, but direct them to the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ. We pray that you will give us those opportunities. Bless us this week. In Jesus' name, amen.